Thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this keynote. ISIC has been a very important and prestigious conference of our field right since it started in 1996 in Finland. And I wish I was there physically with you today in Pretoria, South Africa, but due to COVID, the conference is now being held virtually, so the physical context has changed, yet the content of the speech remains the same, and you and I are interacting, though we are mediated by technology now. So, the title of the talk today is The Many Meanings of Context, and Can We Arrive at a Shared Understanding? And this is the small and beautiful campus that we have in the heart of downtown Boston in Simmons University. And currently I'm almost finishing a book called You Know the Glory, Not the Story, which is the story of 25 people who came to Singapore on that scholarship and who have gone on to find their ikigai, or the reason for being, in various spheres of life. So when I try to think of my research space, at the heart of that is the actor or the user. And Brenda Derwin likes to define this person as a body, mind, heart, spirit moving through time and space with a past history, present reality, and future dreams or ambitions. So it's pretty much any person. So this person, this nuanced person that you are, that I am, that we see all around us, then has some need for information. And this need might arise out of a certain context at work, or it might arise because you're in school and somebody gives you an assignment to work on, or sometimes you're simply curious because you want an answer to a certain question. And when you have any of these scenarios, then you might decide to do nothing about it, or you might decide to look for information. And when you think of that, when you decide on that, then this process of information seeking begins. And you might ask your friends or colleagues for information, or you might go to a reference librarian, or you can get books which might help you with the information, or you could go online and look for computer-based information through computer-based systems, so either a desktop or a laptop computer or a tablet or a smartphone, and you can go to a search engine and go through this information retrieval process. And sometimes we find information serendipitously when we are not really looking for it, and we have this a big aha moment when we find this information, because even though it might not fulfill our immediate need, it might fulfill a need that we have had in the past. And when this information comes about, then we engage in this process of sense making in terms of Brenda Derwin's theory or methodology, where we try to make sense of this information or fulfill this gap or need that we might have, or some sort of a confusion that we might have in our understanding. And it might so happen that in this first level of search, some of the questions get answered, but then new questions arise. And as those new questions arise, we try to engage in this process of search again, or have this repeated keyword refinement in an online system, where after a few rounds, we might decide to give up, not because all our questions have been answered, but we might feel that what we've found so far is enough for now, and we decide to stop at that point. And there are also times when we might avoid information. So I remember when the COVID-19 situation happened for the first month or two, I was constantly watching the news and following the statistics and trying to find out what are the ways in which to manage the situation. But then as time passed and the COVID situation was not stopping over the months, and I found myself not really wanting to look at the latest statistics of what might be happening right now, and deciding not to follow it all that closely. So we can think of it as a way of trying to avoid information. So there are people who are cancer patients, or people who have a certain diagnosis, which they might try to avoid looking at that information right away. Or there are times when we do not respond to messages or phone calls from people, and that has been a subject of my research for the last 2 or 3 years, where I've been looking at the impact of non-response behavior on people who engage with each other through smartphones, when people don't respond to our WhatsApp or iOS or Facebook messages or emails or phone calls. and how does that impact the sender, how does that impact the receiver, and how it impacts the relationship between the two. So all of these things in terms of the information need seeking, information use, information avoiding, information creation, all of that can be seen within this wide umbrella of information behavior. And a related area is that I look at is also knowledge management. And knowledge management can be thought of as a sub-area of the wider information science or the information science and technology field. The only difference here is that rather than looking at the as an actor as the central unit of analysis, here we look at an organization as a unit of analysis. And this need that we have, that we talked about earlier, arises in a certain context, which could be an everyday life information seeking or a work-based context. And that is, this context is what led to this book that I wrote in 2017. This was about what does context really mean, and what does context and information behavior mean. So this is the book, and those are the links for the book. Now, the context behind the writing of this book is that when I was in Singapore doing my PhD at the National University of Singapore, my co-advisor then asked me to do some research on what context, what's the definition of context and what it means, because I was working on an empirical research study at that point for my dissertation, where we wanted to survey like more than 300 people. And I thought that would take me like a week or something, and then as I started digging in deeper and deeper and deeper, I spent about a month trying to score and find as many articles as I could on the topic and to read as much as possible. But what I found was that the more I read, the more there was to know. And the more there was to know, like it kept going on, and I felt like I was peeling onions as I was trying to understand this topic of what context really means. And later on in research, I found that like Darwin termed it as a beast which was like very difficult to tame, this beast called context. So there was a lot of conflicting definitions and differences in how people understood context, and so it became a part of my dissertation then, and it also was a big part of my research over the years. And I found that in proceedings of the ISIC conferences and in JSIS papers and other articles. But so this was a topic that stayed with me for a long time, and later on when I had the opportunity to write a book during my sabbatical, I thought that would be a topic that I should write on. And why is it important for us to talk about context when we talk about information behavior? Now, what happens is that if we do not take context into consideration, then we could assume that everyone or everything is behaving in a predictable manner. So there is this attempt to paint everything with a broad stroke of color, and we find that increasingly in a lot of cases where you have, let's say we talk about information behavior of doctors, or information behavior of lawyers, or how students behave, or how children behave. What we're trying to do is that we are trying to apply our understanding of something to a group of people. And we find that later on in reality, when we go and talk to people, even when we look at doctors, we find that there are lots of individual differences between doctors, or the same doctor, even if a person is of a particular type in terms of interacting with information, the person might behave differently when it comes to the urgency of information need or the importance of a certain task, or when you have a stressful situation like COVID or something else going on. So there are differences in the way a certain person behaves at different points in time, or how different people, even within the same group or a same institution or a same work team, they behave as well. So whenever we hear this term such that it depends or it is subjective, we know that then people are talking about context. So then if we know that context is important, and there are conferences like ISIC and IIIX, or Information Interaction in Context, or CHIIR, which came in later. So all of these conferences that we have, even the ASIST conference or the I conferences, you find context as a big part of these conferences, and even those outside our field as well, in HCI or in ubiquitous computing and other areas. So you find that context is there all the time, but then a question then comes in as to, so what is this context that we are talking about? So as I started delving deeper into this topic, I found that the most common way of understanding context was looking at context as the environment or the container. So which is aspect of a person's life or work role that would influence why a person is looking for information, and the degree to which they would be satisfied with a particular answer. So it is really talking about something that is surrounding a person. So in most of the studies about having this person, which is the actor, and this information seeking studies looked at the actor, and when these studies talked about context, it basically talked about everything that is surrounding the actor or the user at that point. And the second way of looking at context was some sort of a setting, which was typically a physical setting or a socially defined settings in which information users are found. So it could be a work setting such as an office, or a factory, or a library, or an archive, or a company, or a hospital, or a law firm, or even a town or a city. So any kind of physical setting was often seen as context in a lot of studies. And in many cases, context was defined by role. So if the user is a doctor, or a graduate, or a cyclist, or a lawyer, any of those various kinds of roles, or even a child in a school or a preschooler, all of those roles defined the context as well. And in a lot of cases, context was seen as the situation, which is that a lot of the times we find ourselves in certain scenarios or situations not because we want to be there, but because we have to be there, or we are thrown into those settings. Like even the COVID situation is a situation. It's not something that most people would want to be in, but it's something that we have to deal with. So it's something that happens to people. So that is seen as context as well. Then the question is context the actor's mind? So a lot of the times we find that it can be the aspects of a person's physical state, disposition, intentions, identity, or recent experiences of an actor, which bear upon how the actor interprets, understands, acts within, or what the actor notices of the situation at hand. So I might think that I'm sitting on this chair right now talking to you, and this chair is a physical object in itself. But another way of looking at it is that it could be not of the physical entity which exists outside of me, but what I make of this chair and what I think of it in terms of my predisposition towards it. So a lot. So while context can be seen as something that is physically surrounding an actor, which is outside of the actor and is an environment, context in this way of looking can be seen as something which is in the mind of the actor or the person, and which is a much more subjective way of looking at context. And in other studies, context was also seen as information sources and channels. So these are the places that we go to for information, our books and physical devices and other people, or the information horizon that we have. So in terms of Diane Sonnenwald's theory, so this is another way of looking at context. So again, there we have all of these various kinds of information sources, ranging from interpersonal to impersonal sources. And context can also be seen as certain constraints that we have. It could be a host of factors which are external to us, and these are external to our behavior, and these factors influence the selection of strategies that people employ to find information, individual differences and situational factors, which can act concurrently to constrain individual behavior or group behavior. So there are lots of times when we want to do certain things, but we feel that no, I cannot do it because I have a child to take care of, or because I have pet that I need to walk right now, or because you have something that you feel that no, I need to take care of my parents, or so you have some constraint or the other which you feel that stops you from doing something. A lot of the times the constraints are something that we build in our own minds as well. They may not be real constraints, but constraints that we create. So is that context? So any of these things, is constraints a context, is sources and channels a context, is the actor's mind a context, is the situation a context, the role, the setting, or the environment? So these were the various types of things that kept coming around as I was digging deeper into what context might mean. And then in some studies, context was seen as discourse, or the common ground that arises between people when there is social interaction, and there is a dialogue which helps shape large parts of the actor's information behavior. And then in other definitions, I found context as something as assigned meanings during interaction. So this arises out of some activity or a task. So so context was seen as something which isn't just there. Like when we see context as a setting, or context as a container, or an environment, something that surrounds the actor. In that case, the context is seen as something which is there, like this particular room, or the painting of the Taj Mahal that I have behind me. So all of those could be like something that surrounds me. But then in certain definitions, context was seen as something that was actively produced, maintained, and enacted in the course of the activity at hand. So depending on my activity, so if I go to a certain store to buy something, then context is produced at that point. When I'm recording this talk for you right now, then context is produced right now. When I'm talking to someone in person, when I'm playing with a child, when I'm teaching to a class, then context is actively produced in those various interactions. So in this case, the context is local to each occasion or activity or action, rather than the context and the content, or the context and the actor being two separate entities. And also the context can be seen as embodiment and portability. So these are aspects of time and space. So let's say that you are in an airport and you're talking to someone on the phone. You're talking to your spouse, or your friend, or a family member, or a colleague. And as you're talking, you get your bags, and then you're waiting to hail a taxi or an Uber outside, and then you start walking out of the airport. So as you go out, your conversation is continuing at this point. So you find that your physical context has changed in terms of your surrounding, because you're no longer inside the airport. Now you're outside waiting for your taxi, but then your content of your conversation on the phone, that remains the same, and that part hasn't changed, because the person you're talking to and the subject of your talk, that part still remains the same. So you find that the context is changing as well. The physical context is changing, and then there's this idea of being embodied in a certain physical surrounding as well. Like let's say a child takes an iPad and sits on a swing, versus comes and sits on the couch inside. So that embodiment within a larger surrounding is also a part of context. And portability, being able to carry that iPad around from one place to the other, or being able to carry a smartphone around and carry on the conversation. So rather than in the olden days when we had to be fixed to a desk in order to in front of a large desktop computer, so that has changed, and that part is changing as well. So we see the context here as changing. So then, looking at these various aspects of what context might mean, the question that came to me was that what is the boundary of context? So which of these aspects of context was true? Was context external to us? Was context part of my mind? Is context produced in a social setting? So which of these people who came up with these definitions was telling the truth? So which of these definitions of context should I believe, or were I to believe? That was something that I grappled with. And then I found that there were certain ways of defining or arriving at a scope of context. So a set of things, factors, elements, and attributes that are related to an entity in important ways, but are not so closely related to the entity that they are considered to be exclusively part of the entity itself. So there is a relationship, but not that deep a relationship, so that it doesn't become the entity. It's something that's still surrounds the entity in some ways in as per this definition. And then I've also found written in literature that the boundary between the entity and context is continually negotiated and renegotiated and that's something that you see in as you try to define context for any of your empirical studies. You come across this very often, this boundary negotiation, and that context is of the actor engaged in an activity at the point of interaction. So that's something that came across as well, that context does not exist in isolation. Context is always with relation to an actor and an activity. So if there is no behavior or there is no activity, if I'm not there in the supermarket trying to buy vegetables during the COVID situation, or if I'm not there playing with a child, or if I'm not there teaching a class, if I'm not there giving a talk or talking to you or talking to a friend, then without that activity, context does not really have a meaning. So without information behavior or information interaction, context doesn't really have a meaning of its own. So context is always of an activity. But in information behavior studies, we talk of context as that of the actor. But let's say in data science, then context could be of the data or any other entity as well. So in some definitions, the boundary between the content and the actor and the context is pragmatic, permeable, and revisable. So the big question that comes in is that does the context determine the behavior, or does the behavior determine the context? And I found that it's both. The context of my surrounding or something that which is there in different ways around the entity or the actor, that context influences the activity of the actor at that point, and then because of that activity, we in turn influence the context for our surrounding activity. So for instance, when we are doing a search for information, then a certain context which can be a need for information that we have, and other things, other constraints that we have, might impact how we look for information. But our looking for information and the results that we get, those impact our future searches for information as well. So then looking at the literature, there was this old Arist paper by Christina Cartwright, which was again very, very helpful to me as I was researching on context. And in her paper as well, there were these three ways of looking at context. So one was looking at context as a container, and looking at which is a positivist view in this case, which means that the context is there, which is more or less stable, which is surrounding the actor. And then the second view was looking at context as constructed meaning, and which is that context is something which is the mind of the actor. And then there was this other thing, which is the socially constructed context, which is constructed in the process of talking and through dialogue, or through the shared groups that we are a part of. So one of the things that emerged in looking at context was that context is actively produced at the point of interaction, which is an occasion property, a relational property. So context is actively produced, so which means that there isn't any context of Naresh the person per se. As Naresh engages in some activity, then there is a context associated with him. So in any case, so if you can think of yourself in the same way. So whenever you engage in any activity, then that context gets actively produced, depending on the activity that you're engaging at different points in time. When you're at home in your kitchen, when you're at your work desk, when you go outside, when you're walking a dog, all of those are different activities during which the context is actively produced. So this was a painting of elephants in 19th century India that I had painted in 2017. And why I talk about this painting right now is that the thinking about elephants and that ancient story of the 6 blind men and an elephant really helped me understand these various definitions of context. So according to this story of the 6 blind men, they all saw the elephant, and one person felt the leg of the elephant and thought it was a tree, and then one person felt the trunk of the elephant and thought it was a snake, and when one person felt the tail and thought it was a rope, and so on. So they all felt different parts of the elephant. They were all blind, and then they had a different understanding of what the elephant was. Now the question comes in is that which of them was speaking the truth and which of them was lying? And the answer is that they were all speaking the truth, because they were, but it's just that all of their understanding was limited based on the limited interactions with the elephant. And in order to understand the whole elephant, we had to look at the holistic picture, taking all of their understandings into consideration. So this is what actually influenced me when I painted the cover for the book over here, which was basically looking at this elephant and how context is not just a limited aspect or a limited view. It's only when we take all of these different views, when we take context as a container, context as constructed meaning, and socially constructed context, when we take all of these views into consideration, that we begin to come up with some understanding of what we mean by context. So this taking all the views into consideration was a big epiphany for me, and that was what I arrived at after that 1 month long investigation of trying to define context, when my advisor asked me to work on that. Now, one of the theories which helped me understand context was the social identity theory. We might think of ourselves as complex individuals with our various needs and aspirations and all that, and we are part of various social groupings, and we have multiple identities that we have of ourselves. But often when we meet people outside, we might find ourselves engaging in this process of stereotyping, where we might understand only one or two aspects of someone, and we see them as belonging to a certain group based on the limited understanding or limited interaction as we have of those people. So there could be this stereotyping that we might be engaging in based on race, based on ethnicity, on skin color, on age, on gender, on sexual preference, disability, religion, profession, etc. So Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Nobel laureate, he wrote in 1922 that we are in a haste to seek general types and to overlook individuals. So this is a soft copy of the book, and let me just find Tagore over here. So it says that people have a certain collective idea of people based on race, ethnicity, skin color, gender, nationality, and so on, that obscures that humanity. And when we approach a person who's under the influence of this collective idea, he or she or they is no longer a pure individual with his conscience fully awake to the judging of the value of a human being. So they are more or less a passive medium for giving expression to the sentiment of a whole community, or a collective idea based on race, gender, skin color, and so on. So it is evident that this collective idea is not creative, it is merely institutional. It adjusts human beings according to some mechanical arrangement, and it emphasizes the negative side of the individual, the separateness. It hurts the complete truth. So when I tried to understand that social identity theory, and I found that that exact thing was happening in the context of our understanding of context as well, is that when we were saying that context is a container, or context is that which surrounds an individual, we were engaging in a process of stereotyping a context based on one aspect of context. We were not there to looking at the holistic aspect of context. So then I came up with what I call the contextual identity framework, which helps us understand the boundaries of context. And here I came up with 3 views of context. So the first view was looking at context as constructed meaning. So here you find that there is this person, or the actor, engaged in information behavior, and this person might have various groupings as part of the person's identity, and the sources of information that the person is familiar with, the people that the person engages in, and it might include people, it might include computer systems that a person is familiar with, and books and manuals and so on. And then there are other people which might be outside the immediate circle or comfort level of this actor or the user, and this is the person that a person might tend to stereotype, And also there might be other data or other books or other computer-based systems which a person doesn't really understand, and those could be part of our close identity group as well. So this is something that anything and things that are within our circle, these are a part of my personal context, things that are clear to me, I'm familiar with, and I'm comfortable with. And information sources and people which are outside of my comfort level, those are the ones that I tend to stereotype. So that's part of my out group, and these inner ones are part of my in group. So this first view of context, which is a personal view of context, can be seen as the actor's context as seen by the actor, or my context as I see it, so which is the I in context. And the second view of context, which is a shared view of context, which is a we in context. So let's say I'm collaborating with you on a project. So you and I, when we work together, then I have my own view of context. I have a series of identities based on the place I work, or based on my gender identity, or my work role, and so on, or ethnicity and languages I speak, or profession that I have. And you might have your identities based on that, your multiple identities. But we also have a shared identity of working together. We might have a common research interest, or we might have a certain worldview, or we might be part of the same profession, or share a same age group, or a same physical location, or the same workplace. So we have certain things that we share. So that's part of our in-group, which is a shared context, and we have our own individual work context as well. And there are things and people that we don't understand, and those are part of the things that we tend to stereotype, and those are our stereotyped contexts. So this second view, which is the socially constructed context, or part of the dialogue, which is the shared view of context. And then there is this third view of context, which is context as a container. And this is the stereotyped view that I earlier talked about. So here we might be that typically when there is a person who's trying to design a search system, or to make an app, a system developer who's writing an app, or a person or a researcher who's conducting research on a group of people. So most of the time that when we try to study other people, or build an app for somebody else, or provide a service to people as to our library patrons, and we work in the library. So whenever we look at people as them, or as customers, as for doctors, when we look at people as patients, so in that case, this idea of he, she, or they, or them, right? That very idea has a level of stereotyping that goes on, because we can see people as part of a certain grouping, or so either individually or as part of a group. And there are studies that are done in ethnographic based studies, where we actually try to go and understand people, live with them. And in this case, the stereotyping is less, because we try to really understand and have lived in experiences with people. Sometimes we carry out action research, but even here there is still a level of stereotyping that happens, even though we can know spouses and partners and friends and colleagues, but there is still a level of assumption and stereotyping that can happen even in those very close interactions. So this was looking at the boundaries of context in terms of three views of context as a personal view, a shared view, and a stereotyped view. And all of those views coexist in order for us to understand context properly. The next part for me was to try to look at the elements of context. So what are the parts of the whole that make up context? So in this case, when we have this personal view of context, and the stereotyped view, and a shared view, I put them in different lines, because the personal view of context is often the strongest, where we have a great understanding of our own selves, and we have a close identity with our own understanding of that context. A shared view of context is where we have a collaborative information behavior when we are partnering with someone and working with someone on a project. And then we have this third view, this stereotyped view of context, where we see people as part of a circle, some level of stereotyping that goes on, where we see them as part of a grouping, or some part of their identity, and we don't really understand the whole person so much. And I found that the categories of variables for context could be put into these 7 groups. So which is environment. So environment is very closely associated with this surrounding or these something that surrounds the actor. So that was one part of context. The second part of context is the task or the activity or the problem or the situation, something that you're working on right now, and something which often gives rise to a need for information. So this information required or the need for information, so that is an aspect of context as well. So the environment, the task, the need, and the actor themselves as well are an important part of the context, the actor's mind. And then the source or the system or the channel, the places where we go for information. The relationship between the actor and the source, so that relationship, whether I'm comfortable with the source or not, whether I'm familiar with a certain system or not, that is an important part of context, and as well as time and space. So these, if we take these 7 factors into consideration, or 7 aspects of these 7 factors, then we can say that we have pretty much a holistic understanding of a context of an actor in an interaction with the information at a certain time and space. So if we take these elements of context in the personal view of context, you find that I'm just creating 3 circles here of personal context, of shared context, and a stereotyped context. So the actor here has a certain need for information, and then you have a workplace as well, and there's a certain environment which is a part of the workplace. So when my personal context and my workspace, they both interact, then there could be a task which I'm asked to work on, like for instance being asked to deliver this keynote speech today. So that could be a task that came about with my interaction with my environment, and then there was certain information required for me to prepare for it, and the sources that I consulted for it. So that these sources could be part of my shared context, or could be outside of my comfort zone. So it could be something that is stereotyped, but as I become more familiar with the source, so let's say I need to consult various books or proceedings of the ISIC conferences. So as I read up more on them, as I get more familiar with those studies, then they become part of my shared context. So there's a constant tension between the shared context and stereotyped context. So there could be a flow between the two, and often the stereotyped context could become part of our shared context as we get more familiar. So the relationship between the actor or the source, whether you're comfortable with the source or not, and time and space. So all of these are various dimensions of context when you try to understand them and look at various studies of information behavior which is involved context, so that you find that some variable of one of these factors would become part of those studies. So what are the variables or attributes that can help measure each element of context? So this is what I found, that in most of the studies, so there were variables of the environment. So there is the type of organization, or the structure, or diversity, or flexibility, or goals, decision-making styles, and discourse, employees, familiarity with each other, culture. All of those one of more of these factors were used in different studies, and these are contextual variables. In certain studies looked variables of the task, the type of task, the nature of the task, the goal, a characteristic, the stage or the step of the task, whether a task is complex, whether the task is difficult, whether a task is non-routine, is it urgent. So all of those will also impact a person's looking choice of information sources, and person's need and behavior as well. So when something is urgent, we behave differently, versus when something is non-urgent. When something is important, we might consult different sources, and as opposed to when something is not so important. So then again, the need for information required, aspects of the actor, demographics, coping style, social role, cognitive styles, curiosity, and so aspects of the source or the channel of information, aspects of the relationship between the actor and the source, the degree of comfort, degree of familiarity with the source or system, and time and space, duration, time of day, week or year, in the immediacy or the time of interaction. So you'll find that any of these variables, when we see them in different studies, we know that they're talking about context. So I spent about many months reviewing the literature on various proceedings of the ISIC conferences, and on other studies in our field and in other related fields. And I found that in all of those studies, there are one or more of these variables that are used in many of these empirical studies, and they are all contextual variables. So then, having looked at that, let us try to arrive at a definition for context. So in the book, based on the literature review and the contextual identity framework, we can arrive at a few conclusions about context. So one is that context is of an entity So one is that context is of an entity with respect to a behavior or activity. So it is that the context does not exist on its own. It is always with respect to some behavior or some activity. Second is that context is always about relationship, often actor with elements outside of the actor. So people, artifacts, process, situations, environment, or even of the actor with themselves, depending on who's watching. And context is not one whole concept which will look the same from every direction. So depending on who you are, where you're looking from, and who the actor in question is, context will appear differently to you. So there are the personal view, the shared view, and the stereotyped view. So these views, again, if I'm looking at my own context, that's different. When I'm trying to study somebody else's context, that's different. Okay. So for an actor looking at one's own context, which is a personal view, everything will appear as context. The actor's personal context, such as thoughts, feelings, identity, abilities, etc. The shared context of the actor as a part of groupings based on age, gender, ethnicity, and so on. And the stereotype context of the actor, so people who are outside of these. So everything will appear to be context to me in my personal view. So, however, an interpretive researcher studying the actor in one's own context might decide to focus on more of the dynamic aspects of the context and may not choose to include the more stable attributes. So there are parts of a personality which change and parts which remain more stable with time. So I have tried to highlight these in terms of italics. So things which with like organizational climate or a person's coping style or risk aversion. So some of these are some of those remain like more or less stable, and some things which change more actively, like mood and so on, mood, interest, motivation, and so on. So I've tried to make a distinction between relatively stable versus changing context. And for an actor looking at one's context with a friend, colleague, or collaborator, part of a shared group, context includes the personal context of the two actors. Okay. And for a positivist researcher or a system designer looking at a participant's or user's context, context will be everything that surrounds the actor, such as the physical setting, the environment, the people. Okay. So Lee defines context as a set of things, factors, elements, and attributes that are related to a target entity in important ways, but are not so closely related to the target entity that they are considered to be exclusively part of the entity itself. So thus a researcher may choose to not see the most stable attributes of actors and of sources or channels. So here in this case, so there are these different views will also determine how you're looking at context. And the elements of the context of an actor engaged in an activity include aspects of the environment, the task or problem situation, the need, the actor and his or her identity, the source system. So these are the 7 elements that we looked at. Those are part of the context. And the relationships among the elements of and the different views of context can be understood via properties, which help to perceive the central structures and regularity, and to underline the dynamism between the modular descriptions of context. So there are different properties which I define more in the book, and so according to which the elements of context can differ based on the level of magnitude, ranging from the micro to the macro. So for instance, when you have a nearby element like a cup of coffee, a book one is reading, so that is part of our micro context, things which are very close to us. And we might have a more macro context, which is like a government or a neighbor or a next street. So those are there, which are also influencing, but maybe not as directly. Sometimes there's a more direct influence, but depending on different times, we might have that some things have a bigger impact than some other things. And the different elements of context during the course of an interaction would differ based on the level of dynamism, ranging from the static to the dynamic. And things that remain mostly constant over time, for example, one's office space, or the color of one's wall, or the time of browsing, these are more or less static. But there are some things which might change more dynamically. For instance, a web page one is reading, so that can be much more dynamic because we might move on to the next page very quickly. And there are elements of context which may be repetitive or non-repetitive. So something which just happens once, or something which is an exception. So for example, an actor might use the Facebook app on a smartphone on a regular basis, and there might be another app that's used like much more infrequently. So, and a person in an office job would have a more regular surrounding context as opposed to a traveling salesman. So some parts of context might change more rapidly, and some might remain more or less the same over the span of a few months or a year, and so on. And there can be numerous combinations between different elements of context, many of which can co-occur on a frequent or regular basis in an actor's information behavior. An actor might need to respond to a situation on a regular basis. For example, the student might needing to answer the queries raised by a professor in the same classroom and at the same time of the day during the semester. So based on these 12 conclusions, I then arrive at a common definition of context. So the context of an actor's information behavior consists of elements such as an environment, task, actor, source, relationship, time. So those are 7 factors that we looked at. And these elements are relevant to the behavior during the course of interaction, and they vary based on magnitude, dynamism, patterns, and combinations, and that appear differently to the actor than to others, who make an in-group, out-group differentiation of these elements depending on the individual and shared identities. So it's a long definition, it is kind of a complex definition, but I think it captures this beast that Brenda Derwin called in trying to define what context is. It's only when we really look at all of these things in totality that we can get an understanding of what context really means and how we can go about attempting to try to define context. So I think I would invite you to take this work in the book and in the talk today and try to refine this and to further simplify this definition with time, but something which gives us an understanding or a more nuanced and holistic understanding of what context is all about. And the book has other topics. It has a huge literature review section. The discussion section talks about how we can design research studies incorporating context. And we talked a little bit about the movement between stereotyped and shared context, depending on as we get familiar with the source, and how context can overlap and change continuously. This part we just talked about, the 12 conclusions about context. And then context now and also in the near future. So it's something that is it's really changing, because now when we look for sources and then we get information, we might be getting misinformation rather than an information. So fake news and misinformation is a huge topic and a huge concern now, something that really affects all information professionals, and things about, again, non-response behavior that I earlier talked about. So there's this thing about our lives which are tied between the physical and the virtual and the hybrid in between, and how we navigate through that. And now this whole understanding how COVID is affecting our whole behavior across the world. So there are lots of these different changes in contexts that are continuously happening. But in order for us to really understand and navigate through these changes, we need to understand how we view our own contexts, and how we view the contexts of those people who we are choosing to design systems for or to provide services for, and how we see the contexts of somebody when we have a shared group that we are a part of. So this was an infographic of 2019, that what's happening in one internet minute, and how the contexts of our interactions with people mediated by technology and through smartphones and apps are making us into putting us into very different scenarios than we have ever been in the past. So that's a part of the changing context right now. So thank you, and I think I'll stop here. It's a big topic. We could go on for a long time, but I think I'm ready to take your questions now. And if you do want to contact me over email or through Twitter and other means, there are my contact details written over there. So thank you.